Here's what's coming up on your horizon. Well, it's been a bit of a rough patch for Oklahoma's energy industry this past year. A dip in prices has cut production and led to layoffs, while the growth in earthquakes is increasingly pointing towards our injection wells. This week, we look at how the industry and regulators are responding to both. We'll talk with industry insiders, state officials, attorneys, and scientists about two issues that have a direct impact on our state's economy. Stay with us for Oklahoma Horizon.
Oklahoma Horizon is made possible by the Oklahoma Department of Career and Technology Education.
Oklahoma's investment in Career Tech provides more than nationally recognized technology education and training. It produces solid financial returns for the state's economic future. Oklahoma Career Tech, elevating our economy.
And the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry, helping good people grow good things. And now, from the Career Tech Studios in Stillwater, here's your host, Rob McClendon.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us here on Horizon. Well, it's hard to imagine an industry any more important to Oklahoma than energy. It generates 1 out of every $3 in gross state product and pays wages often a third more than any other industry sector. That's why, when energy prices began to decline last fall, everyone from the oil patch to the state capitol began to take notice. Combine that with the growing evidence of a link between injection wells and the exponential growth of earthquakes in the state, and the industry is facing some long-term challenges that could reverberate throughout our economy. Today, we're going to look at both sides of those issues, but we begin with how the industry is adjusting to the lower price of oil. Earlier, I sat down with the Williams Company's Senior Vice President of Corporate and Strategic Development, Frank Billings, after he spoke at OSU's Spears School of Business Energy Conference in Tulsa. So, Mr. Billings, is it fair to say that the energy industry is trying to find a new normal in terms of revenue?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think what the energy industry is trying to do is adapt to the new price environment that everyone is operating in. You know, when you drop from $100 down to $50, that's a significant reduction in revenue for a producer. Basically cuts their revenue in half, and they still have the same operating expenses associated with that. So I think that from a production perspective, I think the answer is yes. People are going to have to figure out how to adapt in a lower commodity price environment. As it rolls through to our infrastructure business, we have to figure out what that means to our volumes and our revenue streams, because we may have less throughput, or we may not have the same amount of volume flowing through our assets as people make decisions on where to reduce production in response to a lower price environment.
A price dip that's nothing new to the industry. As this chart shows, the energy cycle was fairly flat through the 1980s and 90s, gradually rose in the early 2000s, and then spiked in 2008, only to fall in the Great Recession of 2009. Climbed back over the following 5 years, only to plunge once again in the fall of 2014. You know, I think it's only human nature to believe that the landscape today, the economic landscape today, is going to be the reality of tomorrow. And how do you get people to take a look at the long-term picture when we talk about the ups and downs of the energy industry?
You know, that's a good question too, because normally the people who are trying to recognize the revenues off the commodities are really looking for what that does for them today. Usually it's the demand sides where the longer-term perspective needs to come in, because for someone to make an investment in, say, a petrochemical plant or a power plant or a refinery, they need to know that there's long-term supply. And the only way that long-term supply comes is if someone's willing to produce the commodity. And to produce that commodity over a 20-year, 30-year life cycle of an investment, they need to know, one, that the supply is going to be there, but at what price is that going to be available to them. So I think, to me, that's really the challenge that we have today, is that with the uncertainty in price, or the volatility in price that we've seen over the last year, what is that price signal that producer could ultimately sell into that market at? And I think that's really the thing that people are going to have to get settled in on.
A new reality brought on by the dramatic increase in U.S. production, called the Shale Revolution. Using the fracking process and advanced drilling techniques, drillers can now pull oil and gas from the ground like never before. How important has the independent producer been in what is been an energy revolution here in this country?
The independent energy producer has been vital to the growth. They've really been the one that has been innovative in going after these new U.S. shale fields and going after these U.S. shale plays that people thought weren't going to be productive. And it's that innovation and that's willingness to really take a risk and go into areas where other people's had left that has really driven that revolution. So I would just say they've been critical and key to the development of the U.S. oil and natural gas growth over the last 5 years.
After 6 months of decline, the falling rig count has bottomed out. All the while, U.S. oil production has remained steady. Thanks to fierce cost-cutting and productivity improvements, frackers can still make money with their shale wells, even with oil prices at a third below the 7-year average.
The independent producer has figured out how to reduce costs. Their spud-to-spud time has really dropped dramatically. So a rig today can be as productive as 2 or 3 rigs were 2 or 3 years ago. So even though the rig count has gone down, the productivity or the efficiency of that rig has stayed the same or actually improved, so that they can get the same amount of production out of one rig as it took maybe 2 or 3 to do in past years.
Just how integrated is natural gas into today's society? I mean, people typically think of it's going to power our homes. It may drive a car, but it also has other uses as well.
It is very integrated. I mean, one of the things that people don't recognize is fertilizer is made out of natural gas, and methanol is made out of natural gas, and obviously it fuels steel mills. If you talk to the guy at U.S. Steel, their cost of steel production has gone down tremendously because of the price of natural gas. So it's really embedded in all the fabric of what we deal with on a daily basis. Natural gas derivative products, like when you look at, it's always funny, you see a Patagonia jacket or you see a plastic water bottle. Those are all made out of natural gas derivative products that come through the production and through the ultimate continued processing of ethane into ethylene, ethylene into propylene, propylene into downstream more polymer fibers. So all of that really comes from natural gas. People don't see that. They don't recognize it that way because it's not intuitively obvious. But really, a lot of what's growing our economy is really an ultimate result of natural gas and the production of natural gas in the U.S.
All right, Mr. Billings, thanks for your insights.
You bet. Thank you.
And while our energy sector will certainly rebound, a new report suggests that the revenue for oil and gas producers in Oklahoma could drop by more than a third this year. A downturn that could eventually result in the loss of 11,000 industry jobs. Mark Sneed, the founder of the economic research firm RegionTrack, told the Journal-Record the state has already experienced the loss of 8,400 oil and gas-related jobs. Now, his forecast indicates that Oklahoma's oil producers will end up suffering a 38.1% drop in revenue this year. That after a record $11.4 billion in revenue last year, which he projects could be down to about $7 billion this year. Now, when we return, we keep our local perspective on the industry and look at the growing number of earthquakes here in Oklahoma.
You're watching Oklahoma Horizon, featuring some of the good things that are happening in the great state of Oklahoma.
Well, Oklahoma continues on a record pace of earthquakes that some studies show are being caused by injection wells. Through the first 4 months of the year, there have been 468 earthquakes in the state with a magnitude of 3.0 or greater. Now compare that to this time last year, and that's an increase of over 90% according to the U.S. Geological Survey. Joining me now is our Courtney May.
Well, Rob, in late June, the Oklahoma Supreme Court reversed an earlier lower court ruling that will allow a preg woman to seek damages from an injury she sustained when her fireplace crumbled after an earthquake she believes was caused by pumping wastewater into the ground. This ruling is just the latest to expose Oklahoma's energy industry to litigation over their disposal wells.
The oil and natural gas industry is pumping in tens of billions of dollars to the state's economy each year. As the 5th largest oil and gas producer in the United States, Oklahoma is creating jobs.
And it employs in the energy sector 1 in every 4 Oklahomans. So it creates a tremendous amount of revenue in our state. Close to 1/3 of our revenue that's generated is generated by some form of energy.
However, this comes with some earth-shaking news. Over the past 3 years, Oklahoma has more than tripled in its rate of earthquakes, passing California. And scientists have recently linked water injection sites, the aftermath of fracking, to seismic activity.
The concern for Oklahoma is Class 2 wastewater disposal wells. And those wells are used to dispose of fluids that are produced that aren't good enough quality to be released in a stream. That process was first shown to be a problem with causing seismicity back in the 1960s at a place called the Rocky Mountain Arsenal.
Todd Hallahan is an OSU geologist who studies earthquakes around the globe and says, as this graphic shows, the growth in Oklahoma earthquakes has been increasing significantly since 2008, and he believes it's important for the industry to operate responsibly, which means knowing when, where, and how much water to inject into the ground. Hallahan says monitoring the injection wells most likely to trigger earthquakes will lead Oklahoma onto less shaky ground.
It's actually risky for both the citizens and the industry. And people look at it as citizens against the industry, but it's actually risky for both of them.
Attorney Graydon Luthie has dealt with several cases affecting both the oil and gas companies as well as landowners in Oklahoma, and says something must be done to ensure that the industry is drilling and injecting water back into the ground responsibly, and that landowners are well informed about the issue and are taking reasonable safety precautions, just like the oil and gas industry.
What are the obligations of the oil and gas company? What are the expectations that policy will recognize that landowners have in things like this?
All right, here you see some of the recent cracks that have been
expectations that homeowners like Sean Hull have, whose house is developing new cracks each week from the increasing number of earthquakes.
Earthquakes happen, then the cracks develop, and I couldn't say how many there are, probably 15 or 20. This here is the garage, and what you see is previously repaired cracks and also brand new cracks that are contributing to the old cracks as well, and a brand spanking new one right over there. I think it's absolutely important for the United States to have energy independence, and if this is a result of fracking, I think that it probably needs to be done, but the people that are responsible for drilling need to be responsible for, the property that they're destroying.
Damages to properties are one of the reasons Governor Mary Fallin announced the launch of a Seismic Activity Council consisting of members from the oil and gas industry, the Oklahoma Geological Survey, the Corporation Commission, and university researchers.
When they've looked at which wells might be causing this, it's typically a small number that are at a really high rate. And so it doesn't mean you have to shut the whole thing down. You have an option of pulling back partway. It's a difficult industrial process that has risks and needs to be conducted responsibly.
The future of the industry is going to be headed forward in a safe manner, in an economically responsible manner, in a manner where Oklahomans can all enjoy the benefit of job creation.
Without the fear that with the good comes the bad of more earthquakes.
So Courtney, recognizing that for every barrel of oil we produce using the fracking method, we also produce between 10 and 100 barrels of wastewater. What do we do with all this water if we don't pump it back into the ground?
Well, and that's the problem. And there seems to be easy answers, but with those answers comes environmental challenges.
What about using trucks to haul the water away to environmentally less sensitive areas?
Well, if you've ever carried a bucket of water, you know that it's heavy. So 120 barrels of wastewater into a giant tanker truck could cause significant damages to our state roads and highways. And also, for every barrel of oil we produce, it takes a giant tanker truck to carry that wastewater away.
So lots of traffic congestion then. Then what about pipelines?
That comes with cost and also effects to the environment. It would be extremely expensive to create these pipelines, and also these pipelines would have to be ran through the most densely populated areas of Oklahoma.
So then what about like what agriculture does with their lagoons, like just keeping the water in place and then letting it evaporate?
Well, once again, we're talking about a whole lot of water, and a lot of people think that that could affect local weather. And also, once the evaporation process happens, we would have to go back and dispose of the salts and the chemicals that are left behind.
So it sounds like this really comes down to a cost-benefit ratio, especially when you consider that other states may not have some of these same restrictions.
Right, that's true, but we're not the only state that's looking into closer regulation. Texas Governor Greg Abbott just recently okayed a $4.5 million comprehensive earthquake study.
All right. Thanks so much, Courtney.
You're welcome, Rob.
Now, when we return, I'll sit down with the state official whose job is to regulate Oklahoma's energy companies, Corporation Commissioner Dana Murphy.
Want to share something you've seen here today? Well, all of our episodes are streaming on our YouTube channel at Oklahoma Horizon TV, or you can subscribe to our weekly free podcasts on iTunes.
A Corporation Commissioner Dana Murphy comes at her job with a unique skill set. A former working geologist, Murphy went on to law school and worked as an administrative law judge at the Corporation Commission before being elected to statewide office in 2008. Now, I was able to sit down with Commissioner Murphy for a frank and enlightening discussion about the growing number of earthquakes in Oklahoma. So, Commissioner Murphy, how are the concerns over seismicity, how are they changing the industry?
Well, I think now the companies have to become much more aware of things than they were aware of before. It used to be they were mainly concerned with, okay, we've got to set surface casing and do things to protect freshwater aquifers. Now we've got the issue of the public living in areas where their homes are affected by possibly what it is that we're doing in a particular area. So I think the gamut of what the industries had to become aware of is much bigger. I think the regulators are having to look at things that they never had to look at before. So I think it's really challenging on all fronts. And then to make sure that we're following what the science tells us to do. It's one thing to say, well, we need to do this or we need to do that, but we really need to be moving in the direction that the science tells us and working with seismologists and others, and that's really what we're trying to do.
So if I could I get you to put on your geologist hat now? You brought various maps with you. Explain to us in as much layman terms as you can, what is the issue we're talking about versus fracturing and disposal wells?
Okay, well, hydraulic fracturing is basically a completion technique that's been involved for about 60 years. And it's done whether you're producing from shallow formations or deeper formations. So what's happened really with hydraulic fracturing is that the longer these laterals have become with horizontal wells, you typically have more fracturing involved, different stages along the length of the lateral, because you're accessing more of the formation with a lateral instead of coming down vertically. So the technique of hydraulic fracturing has been around for a long time. It's just the number of them, the volume of water, and that's actually being used with some of these. So that's really what is kind of the different dynamic now. So as I mentioned during my talk, there have been some instances where you might see seismology associated on a very localized basis with where a hydraulic fracturing job might occur with a completion. But it would typically be lower magnitude, very short-lived, and then it's over. That's very different than when you have a disposal well that comes maybe into a deep formation such as the Arbuckle, and you're continually putting water into the Arbuckle. You know, once you drill a well and you hydraulically fracture it and you complete it, you're not doing that anymore, you're finished. But as far as disposing of water that comes up typically when you're producing oil and gas, it's naturally occurring water that comes up when you're actually producing oil and gas, is the ability to dispose of that water. What do you do with it? Different states have had to deal with that particular issue, and in Oklahoma we've been dealing with it. Look, we've been doing this for hundreds of years with not this issue about seismicity, but I think it's the horizontal development, the proliferation of access to reserves that we've never accessed before. I think all these things have kind of led to where we are now, and it's just something that we have to stay on top of and on an ongoing basis. I hope that's helpful, just to let people know there's a difference when you drill and complete a well and you're finished with it being producing. Then when that well starts producing and the water that comes out with the oil, and oil and gas, what do you do with that water? That's the challenge.
Mm-hmm. And you said deep well. Can you define that? How deep are we talking about? And what type of, are there different rocks the deeper we go?
You typically have just all along the geologic column is what we would call it, different formations. It would be shales, limestones, sandstones, anywhere from the freshwater aquifers at the top to where you might drill down as deep as 10,000 feet. So typically when we talk about the Arbukle's a limestone, very fractured, very porous, easily absorbs water, and for many, many years that's where operators have been disposing of water. And you have to remember, some of these wells are not high volume wells. I mean, it might be, a few hundred barrels, a day versus some of these wells that are actually dealing with higher volume. So the concern that we have really is higher volume disposal wells like we haven't had before. Because let's say you go out and drill 10 horizontal wells and you've got this water coming in a particular area. What do we do with the water that's coming out of the particular area? We've got a high volume disposal well where instead of maybe putting 200, 300, 400, 500 barrels of water a day, you might be looking at anywhere up to 20,000 barrels a day. So that's what's really changed about the dynamics of development in a particular area that really necessitates where you need to deal with water in that particular area. It's very expensive if you had to truck the water away from the particular area. So the dynamics that are different now is a lot of the companies were actually having to come in and put the infrastructure in place for disposal before they even drill their wells. That's a very different dynamic. We've never had to deal with that really before.
And an expensive dynamic.
Very expensive.
Yeah. Can we attribute a specific well to a certain trimmer?
I think originally that was what a lot of effort was made to try to isolate particular wells with particular seismicity, so then you could shut that well in, research it, see if there needed to be things done with it. And now I think it's really to look at more of an overall area, because there might be this particular well that's disposing, and then a few miles around it there might be more wells that are actually disposing. So I think we're having to look more on an overall, in a particular area, looking at the overall fluid that's actually being disposed of, or overall fluid movement. That's become much more important now, along with looking at where stressed faults are. That's really important to know as well.
Yeah, and you did bring a map with you about the faults and maybe some new faults that we didn't know until we got so good at discovering them.
Well, typically what the companies do, they go out and do 3D seismic surveys. Very expensive, confidential. It's a very competitive type thing to figure out where they're going to drill, where are the best places to drill. Well, off of this data, you can also get information that helps you interpret faults. Well, the Oklahoma Geological Survey and their seismologists have never really had access to that data because they don't regulate the industry. They don't have any requirement for them to provide it. And at the Corporation Commission, we haven't been asking companies to provide that. But now, we have been asking that they provide it so that we can get a better, depiction of where faults are and areas that we maybe need to avoid and look at more carefully. And I will give the industry credit for providing the information that regulators, we would never otherwise have access to that data.
Mm-hmm. You also showed the seismic map and just showing the increase in seismic activity here in the state. Is this a challenge for the industry that could be a bigger challenge than even low prices if they can't get a handle on the public's perception of one is causing the other?
Well, I can't just put it all in the industry. I think, the regulators too. I mean, we have to be able to, when I go out and speak, I have to be able to explain what we're doing and why we're doing it and where the science is leading us. Because you can't just, it's easy for government to just be reactive and a lot of times to overreact to things. So it's what's the proper action to take and how do you explain it and how do you justify what it is? And I think that's the question that we're being asked. And do I think this is a big challenge for the industry? I do. I think that along with just the dynamics of, hydraulic fracturing, low prices, environmental regulations, I think there's a lot of challenges on the industry side now.
Mm-hmm. Commissioner Murphy, thank you so much.
Hey, thank you.
Next time on Oklahoma Horizon, we get an inside look at the inner workings of the legislation that sets our nation's food policy and the Oklahoma congressman who guided the Farm Bill into being.
The most amazing outside groups that came after us like the hounds from hell. It took 2.5 years to do, in my opinion, what should have been 6 months.
Oklahoma Congressman Frank Lucas on Oklahoma Show over the Heartland, Oklahoma Horizon. Thanks for including us as part of your day. I'm Rob McClendon. Hope to see you back here next week.